Okay, so we have had a lot of interest from our ASP community on state legislators and state rights, especially since the overturning of Roe v. Wade. So we are here today with Tim Storey of the National Conference of State Legislators to talk about state government elections, and their ballot measures. Tim, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, what a pleasure. Thank you, Mark. Chris, thank you.
So states play an important role in crafting public policy, and experts and policymakers have often referred to states as laboratories of democracy. So can you first explain what it means to say laboratories of democracy, and why does it matter?
I love this because, I've heard that saying, being in the state world domain ecosystem, I've heard that, 1,000 or 1,000,000 times in my day. And I knew its origins, but I just did a tiny bit of looking up because I'm sort of fascinated, like what's the genesis, what's the root of something like that. So we know that these states are often referred to as the laboratories of democracy. It was actually Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis in 1932 in a case that had to do with people who made ice back when there were no refrigerators. And the people of Oklahoma decided that they didn't want to require a license for ice makers, for people who provided ice. And of course, the entrenched ice lobby sued and said, no, you got to have a license. You can't just let any yahoo make ice or bring ice in from out of state. And it went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the court overturned Oklahoma's law and said, no, the U.S. Constitution allows licenses for ice makers. And so Justice Brandeis in his dissent said, a single courageous state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without the risk to the rest of the country. So, basically saying states can sort of pioneer their own policy. And there's great examples of that today. For example, one that probably many of your viewers are aware of, marijuana policy. So we know there are a handful of states, really now going back to when Colorado and Washington first legalized marijuana, that have been sort of forging ahead on recreational use marijuana. And other states have looked at that to see how it's going and have followed it. Another example that Chris, you may be familiar with, Massachusetts had the first Obamacare law. The first sort of Affordable Care Act was based on a Massachusetts law that they had pioneered to try to solve the vexing problem of uninsured Americans who needed health care. California right now, just recently, has passed some enormous pieces of legislation around the environment, requiring that they get rid of gas-powered cars in the not-too-distant future, and requiring that the state get 90% of its energy from non-fossil fuel sources, from renewable sources by the year 2035, just 10 years. So states are plowing ahead on this one. Maybe the federal government doesn't have the resources, the will, that kind of thing. Let me just use one more example. Many states, including Texas, have decided through their elected representatives that they want open carry laws for guns. More controversial issue, of course. But so Texas has a very sort of open, without a permit, you can carry long guns, short guns on your person in Texas. And that's how the state of Texas wants to do it, and their citizens and voters. So in a way, states can sort of look in all these areas of education, transportation, criminal justice, and pioneer policies that may or may not work at the national level. And that's what the laboratories of democracy is all about.
Well, you kind of answered the next question. Since states and the federal government share responsibilities and powers, what are some of the policy areas where states play a greater role than the federal government?
Well, Chris, my glib answer is all of them, of course, because I would say that the stuff that really matters to people is really happening in state governments, governors and legislatures working together. Education, 90% of education funding comes from the states and local governments, which means that how much you pay teachers is determined by the states. Do you put money into textbooks or buildings or teachers, or do you take that money and hire more highway patrol people? Do you want to take your tax? The states raise appropriate close to $2 trillion annually in tax money, right? So they have to make a lot of difficult decisions which people care about. Are we going to pay teachers more? Are we going to put more highway patrol out on the roads? Are we going to pass laws that have to do with the environment, roads? Where do we build roads? These kinds of things. Drug prices, something that Washington has not been able to do anything about. Many states are now limiting the co-pays and the price of drugs. For example, 3 states just recently put limits on insulin costs for people, a drug that millions of Americans rely on. And because of the nature of how Washington is and has to look at a much bigger scope, the states have stepped in to solve that issue in their states. It just really does go on and on. But I think the criminal justice, what is a crime and what are the penalties for that? Of course, many states have capital punishment, for example. Many states do not have capital punishment. Another example of laboratories of democracy. And then the controversial things about school curriculum, kind of what's going to be taught in schools, all done by state legislatures and governors. And at what ages do you teach what kinds of subjects? Gun laws. And then, of course, Mark, you referred to it at the top, abortion laws, very controversial, but now completely within the domain because there is no governing federal law which we had under Roe v. Wade. So states are now determining what's best for our citizens, given our circumstances, our culture, where we live, and that kind of thing.
Moving on to the topic of ballot measures. One of the members from the ASP community wanted to know, how are propositions and ballot measures chosen to appear on a ballot?
You use the right word, ballot measures, but there's really sort of 2 categories that bring things to the statewide voters, which is to say the citizens vote on the laws that they will then live under. So that's a ballot measure. Sometimes they go into the Constitution. Sometimes they just go into the statute books and just become the laws. But there's 2 ways that they get there. One is the legislature puts them on the ballot. So that's called a referendum. So the legislature decides, we want the voters to decide this. We haven't been able to craft exactly the right policy or whatever, but we want to see if this is something that the voters agree with the elected representatives. And the thing about elected representatives, representative democracy, is they spend their whole career and time studying the issue and then crafting the right law before putting it into the books. Ballot initiatives are really short, so it's kind of a blunt tool to make law. Don't want to get too sidetracked on that, because you asked how do things get on the ballot? Referendum through the legislature, and then citizens initiative. But only just over half of the states have the citizens initiative process. So in those states like California, Colorado, Washington, these are very active citizen initiative states. People can get enough signatures about, we want to change this law or that law. In fact, in this election, a number of states have abortion laws on the ballot, all of them put on by the citizens initiative process. So the citizens get signatures under the laws. There's, how many are required, that varies greatly by state, and then it goes to the ballot that way. So this year there are 130 ballot measures across the country. And only 29 of those came through the initiative process. 101 of them came with the legislature referring something to the ballot.
What are the most significant ballot measures this year in terms of affecting how states govern?
So usually there are there's 130, and they really are a disparate group of issues that are coming to the ballot. Usually there's a couple that sort of bundle rise to the top, and a handful of states are looking at them. This year, abortion's kind of one of the main issues. There are 6 states that are looking at abortion measures. 3 are going to look to basically put the right to an abortion in state law or the state constitution. 3 are looking to actually tighten restrictions on abortion, something that the legislatures have done in many other states. So that's one of the big ones. Another thing in terms of how states are, and that's an issue, not necessarily how states are governed. There are a handful of states looking at election process, election law questions like, what should we have for voter ID? Exactly what are the requirements to get a voter ID? Those kinds. So not all states require an ID to vote. Again, great example. That's an area where states have very different processes about how they run elections. But one of the most interesting things, Chris, is that the state of Nevada is looking to become the 3rd state to use ranked choice voting. And that's truly a real change in how we're governed as a country. I mean, we've always had that majority, first past the post, sort of winner take all system of elections. But we've now got Alaska, Maine, which have this ranked choice process. Nevada's looking to do a similar kind of thing where the top 5 in the primary would go on to the general election. And then in the general election, you would say, I want these people 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then if your person finishes 5th, they take them out and they reallocate your vote to your second choice. And then they take out the fourth person, and who finishes fourth, they take them out and take your vote and move it back to one of the top three. So it's a little bit complicated, but that's a pretty radical direction for the country in terms of how we count votes for office. So that's happening in Nevada. But there's a lot of stuff on the ballot, including tax measures, some income tax rebates and refunds for some states. But if you go to the ncsl.org website, we have all of it in a database. You can look up by your state, you can look up by issue, find everything that's on the ballot, and it's 100% nonpartisan, straight up. This is what's on the ballot.
And we're going to link to that on our site, I believe, as well. So speaking of all this, there's this renewed focus on ballot measures following, as you said, the Supreme Court's ruling to let states decide how to regulate abortion. So as a result, do you think that the measures are going to what ballot measures are going to change moving forward? Do you think there's going to be more or less? And do you think that the range of issues that they cover will expand or will they shrink?
So there's kind of been a decline. Part of that was COVID and the difficulty of getting signatures and the requirements around the country. It's also very expensive. And like anything that has to do often with public policy, there's money involved, which I'm sure you guys are not surprised to hear. So in a state like California, it can cost millions and millions of dollars just to get something on the ballot. And then, of course, millions and millions of dollars pour in, either oppose or support a ballot measure, usually because policy, somebody's getting affected. It's going to matter to oftentimes some interest that has a lot of economic interest on one side or the other. So your question, Mark, is, is it growing or diminishing? I think that probably what you're seeing, there was a piece in one of the major national newspapers today about increasing attention to policy making at the state level. And I kind of balked at that a little bit because the states have always been making law on abortion and making law on guns and making law on school curricula and all these things that really matter to people. So the notion that there's increased attention, well, that's where the action's been, same as it ever was, if you ask me. In fact, this year there were 175,000 bills introduced in state legislatures, 25,000 passed. So, maybe Washington gets a lot of the cable news attention, but policies being made in the states and local governments as well. So, whether it's through the ballot, but I think the abortion laws are happening more inside the legislature. So it's who's getting elected to those seats that sort of matters the most.
Sure. Well, continuing with state legislatures, nearly all states closely model the structure of Congress with a sort of House of Representative-like body and a Senate-like body. What are some of the key differences in how state legislatures work compared to how Congress works?
Yeah. Interestingly, the U.S. Constitution, and this what was called the Great Compromise in Philadelphia when the Constitution was designed, they copied the states. So the U.S. Constitution was really sort of a replica of the state constitutions at the time. So in some ways, they copied them, so they're more similar to states. But it's a really good question. I think I sort of have two answers. Sort of the mechanical question about they're not in session as long. They tend to have session limits. They're not paid as much. The average state legislator only makes around $35,000 a year. A member of Congress makes in excess of $200,000 a year. And of course, that varies greatly. If you're a legislator in New Mexico, you make $0 a year. If you're a legislator in California, you make about $100,000 a year. So they're not getting rich doing this work. So that's one minor difference. And of course, again, many states have limited sessions. They come in January and they finish their work by May. And then they go back and do other jobs. So there's that. But I think the biggest difference, this is a good question. It made me puzzle for a minute, is that they do kind of get more stuff done. Like I said, I cited those bill statistics. They are dealing with problems. And what's really interesting, and you wouldn't know this if you were to ask people out and about, Republicans, Democrats, they hate each other. They can't be in the same room. Well, that's actually not the case. In legislatures, 85% of the bills they are passing is done bipartisan. It's Democrats and Republicans working together. So I think the biggest difference is that legislators still haven't been, torn apart by the polarization that we're seeing too much in Washington and Congress. And they're working together in sort of very civil ways to solve problems. One of the biggest problems facing the country right now is the mental health crisis, period. And that's, for teenagers, adults, everybody. And there's been a huge increase in legislation aimed at that problem around the country. And again, the federal government's not going to be able to do anything on that.
So this term, the Supreme Court is going to hear the case Moore v. Harper, which claims that the way in which the Constitution is worded, state courts do not have any power to review state election laws. So could you please explain this theory and then how elections will be changed if the Supreme Court agrees that it is the proper reading of the Constitution? I think this is a pretty important question going forward for what happens in elections.
Yeah, so this is a case that comes out of North Carolina. The state of North Carolina had to do with redistricting, which is a pretty arcane process. Every 10 years after the census, we have to change the line so that everybody has equal representation, both in the U.S. House of Representatives as well as in state legislatures and the county commission and the city councils and on down. So in North Carolina, the legislature passed a redistricting map that the state Supreme Court overturned, and then some citizens sued because the legislature appealed. Some citizens sued. Anyways, it's at the U.S. Supreme Court now. The U.S. Supreme Court has agreed to hear a case which is going to try to resolve the question, which comes from the U.S. Constitution, which says verbatim that legislatures shall determine the times, places, and manner of elections for U.S. representatives and U.S. senators. So it sort of narrowly applies to, is it only the legislature that can set time, place, and manner of election for federal legislative officials? Meaning like the day of the election, how long the polls are open, what ID is required, the district shapes or where the districts are, or can the state court review these laws that legislatures have passed? So it's in many ways a very narrow kind of question before the U.S. Supreme Court. And it's basically saying, can state courts overrule legislatures on federal election laws as they apply to members of the House and members of the Senate? Now, I know there's some analysis that say at any time you've got a big Supreme Court case, there's a lot of concern, like, well, maybe they don't do it in a narrow way. The Supreme Court expands it or makes a bigger decision that goes beyond the question at hand. That's up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court can almost do anything it wants in a lot of ways. So right now we're looking at this Moore versus Harper. Tim Moore is the Speaker of the House. Rebecca Harper, I think, is a citizen of North Carolina, a member of Common Cause. And the question is, does the Constitution mean literally legislatures determine the time, place, and manner of elections for House and Senate? Or does it mean that legislatures, including the state courts, are constrained in what they can do? So let's say the court says the Constitution only applies to legislatures' time, place, and manner. That still doesn't mean that they're not contained by the federal law. They can be sued in federal courts, and they're also contained by the fact that legislatures can't just do super crazy stuff that's completely out of line with the people of their state, because there are political consequences to pay, and they are keenly aware that you don't, whatever laws you pass. Look at some of the abortion laws, right? These legislators are not doing it in a vacuum. They think they're representing the people of their states, and of course, the culture and the positions of that vary greatly around the country. So I think we'll have to wait and see what the court does, but it's a pretty narrow question.
In 2018, there was some debate regarding who oversees state elections when Georgia's now governor, Brian Kemp, who was Secretary of State at the time, was in charge of overseeing his own race. Is the system in Georgia common across other states, and who normally oversees elections at the state level?
Well, that's another good question, Chris. The elections in the United States are unique in the world. I've actually done some consulting around the world with parliaments and countries around the globe, and there's three things they don't understand about American elections. Number one, that we, in many cases, do not require an ID to vote. Almost the entire world requires an ID to vote. So that's just kind of unique. You can debate all day long whether we should or should not require an ID to vote, but it's just something unique to the United States. Number two, the Electoral College, which there's really no analog for that around the world. So that's just unique to America. And number three, we have massively decentralized elections. So for a nation of 300 million people, 50 million voters, we run elections in many ways at the county level, but also at the state level. So in most places, and the reason I give you that background is no two systems are alike. So in most cases, the Secretary of State sort of has the authority for, let's say, administering elections and implementing election law. So I guess when you say in charge of elections, that's kind of a tricky way to frame it, because whoever, whether it's the Secretary of State, the county clerk who runs the elections, they are really boxed in and constrained by the laws of the state. In other words, you have to close the poll on this day. You can't start counting the votes until this time on this day. This many people have to observe how the ballots are counted. So there's a vast level of election law. And I will say that, so the answer to your question is it varies greatly by state. In many cases, in most cases, it is the Secretary of State who's in charge of administering the elections. I think you really want to clarify, what does that mean? It's basically following the law. And what I can tell you with 100% certainty is that the vast majority of election officials are just salt of the earth, rock solid people who are trying to follow the law. And we're in this weird, bizarro world where people are like, I don't trust election officials and they're partisan or not partisan. The fact is they are really boxed in by the law itself. And I think most of them, and there's all kinds of checks and balances to prevent shenanigans, which have occurred in the past, not so distant past, but in the past for sure. So secretaries of state, there's a handful of states that have a board of elections. But then the question is, well, who do you find, who is the most pure angel that has no interest in a partisan outcome to be the overseer, the administrator of elections? So most states have systems that are extremely bipartisan. They have Republicans and Democrats kind of overseeing it, election observers, that kind of thing.
Tim, thank you so much for joining us. As we approach the upcoming election, I know our audience, and I know we really feel passionately about people's engagement with their state representatives. I think it's going to be a very interesting time, and you stood at a very interesting nexus of, as you said, where the action is. So thank you so much for sharing some of the information.
Thank you guys. Thanks for taking an interest.